This week on Inside Olympia, housing is one of the most pressing issues facing Washington state. There's not enough of it, it's expensive, and much more will be needed in the coming years. So what strategies is the state legislature considering to grow the housing supply and address affordability? On the program, Democratic State Representative Emily Alvarado, Vice Chair of the Housing Committee in the House, and Andrew Barkis, a Republican member of that committee.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. It is estimated that the state of Washington will need 1 million more housing units by 2044, and at least half of those units will have to be affordable for the lowest income Washingtonians. So who will build that housing? What will it take to build that much housing stock over 20 years? And in the meantime, what actions can the state legislature take to incentivize housing density and take a bite out of the existing housing shortage? Plus, what can be done about housing affordability and rising rents? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week to discuss one of the most pressing challenges facing the state, are two members of the Housing Committee in the State House. Democrat Emily Alvarado is the vice chair of that committee. She's also the former director of the City of Seattle's Housing Office. Republican Andrew Barkis is a longtime member of the Housing Committee who also runs a property management company. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks for having us.
We have the full hour to talk about this issue. It is one of the most pressing issues facing the state. It's also something that has brought together Democrats and Republicans to really work to try to come up with some solutions. You don't always see eye to eye, but are certainly working together and at times finding bipartisan solutions. So let's start with a couple of setting the table questions. The first one is just how does the work you each have done in your private lives, professional lives, in this space, how is it influencing the work you're doing? And let me start with you, Representative Alvarado. As I said, you headed up the Seattle Housing Office. You now work for a nonprofit that does housing work nationally. How is that informing your thinking about policy in the state legislature?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us in this important conversation. I've spent most of my career working in housing, and it's clear to me for many years that we don't have enough housing and that the impact of that housing shortage disproportionately impacts lower income people. So from my experience, I know that we need the market to produce more housing overall, but we also need directed investments that are going to help produce housing that's affordable to lower income people that won't ever be provided by the market. And we have to take steps that are quick and immediate to help people who are struggling with affordability.
Okay. That's same question for you.
Sure.
You come at this from a different perhaps perspective, but what is that perspective and how is it informing your thinking?
Well, I think there's commonality in the perspective. I've been in the property management business for over almost 30 years, it's hard to believe, in all aspects, multifamily and single family, and still have a single family management company here in Thurston County. So I've housed thousands and thousands of people. I mean, our job is to provide that housing, and I've seen the changes in landlord-tenant law. I've seen the constraints of supply. I've seen the market go up and down. And when I became a legislator in 2016, immediately started to see that there was policy moving forward in this arena, and volunteered and spoke out and said, "Hey, I might know how to help in this arena." And from that moment on, it just became one of the subject experts. Worked within our caucus, and then of course bipartisan on a lot of policy around landlord-tenant, and then of course in the supply side issue, working with the stakeholders to try to get at that. And so bringing that private sector, bringing that industry perspective to the policy conversation, I think has been very informative. And like Representative Alvarado, with her perspective and the different things, you have to have both of those when you're looking at the thing in totality. So always beneficial to have people who actually work within the space to be leaders in the policy discussions and ultimately the legislation that comes out of that.
One of the things that I especially going back to that statistic about how many more units of housing the state will need, I'm struck by the fact that some problems that confront policymakers you maybe couldn't predict or wouldn't have been able to predict. But shouldn't we have predicted this housing deficit because we are constantly modeling our population growth? And it seems like we dug ourselves a gigantic hole, and getting out of it, I don't know how you will do in 20 years. But do you have any thoughts on how we, and I will acknowledge that almost every state in the country is dealing with this. The headlines from state capitals across the country right now are about housing, housing affordability, lack of
Right.
housing, red states, blue states. So we're not alone. But nonetheless, how did this happen?
Yeah, well, we have, it's multiple factors that have come together to put us in, as you said, the deficit that we have now. And a few things have been in place. One, we've had very restrictive zoning in our state and in other states as well that really has restricted the amount of homes that we're able to build and the diversity of homes that we're able to build. We have created systems around permitting that are well-intentioned, but often have created barriers to being able to get housing built quickly. We have financing gaps that are significant in our communities. We know that land is expensive, so that by the time you put together the financing that's necessary to build housing, it's no longer affordable. And we need public subsidy and public financing to come in. And we've seen, quite frankly, obstacles to addressing all of those things. We've seen communities that haven't wanted to change their zoning. We've seen local communities, cities and counties who have been unwilling to take action to free up zoning. We've seen systems that are built that put barriers like permitting in place, and we have seen a complete lack of sustained and dedicated investment in affordable housing. And that is a critical piece to make sure that the financing is in place to build the affordable homes, which you said half of the homes that we need to be affordable. And we have no dedicated funding source in this state to fund affordable housing.
And it's interesting you say that because as somebody who covered the state legislature in this state for almost 20 years, I always heard about the Housing Trust Fund. I always heard about putting more money into it and what it would build. And so just as by way of a brief follow-up, given that commitment and given the fact we have that, was it just not enough? Too little, too late? Why wasn't the Housing Trust Fund our path to building that affordable housing?
Yeah, absolutely. The Housing Trust Fund is the state's most effective tool at funding affordable housing, and it has been very effective. You see right now, though, that it's oversubscribed. There is more opportunity to build housing, including housing that's supporting people exiting homelessness, low-wage workers, people with disabilities across the state in rural and suburban and urban communities that, quite frankly, does not have the available funding from the state to be able to move forward. We can make immediate progress with resources. The other piece is that the Housing Trust Fund falls under the capital budget, and it takes an annual fight to get the kind of resource that's dedicated as part of that Housing Trust Fund. What we're looking for this year is a bill, the Affordable Homes Act, which would establish a dedicated resource so that communities can plan, developers can buy land and build a pipeline, and we can have assurance that we can build the affordable homes we need.
Know that the money will be there.
Exactly.
Okay, so same question. How did we get to 1 million household or 1 million unit deficit in a state that has, the Office of Financial Management is putting out population projections annually, and we have the census numbers?
This is where we're going to agree and disagree, right? So
That'll make it interesting.
Yeah, it should. And the Housing Trust Fund is but one tool. And I think if you remember when I was on your program last time with Representative Bateman, we were talking about middle housing. I think the stat was around 40,000. We've only built around 40,000 units in the entirety of the existence of that program. We're not going to build our way out of this problem in 1 million homes using the Housing Trust Fund. It serves a purpose within a certain arena, but it is extremely expensive to build any type of unit in the state of Washington. That's part of our problem when we talk about removing the barriers, even for Housing Trust Fund money into those type of programs and projects and low-income housing or whatever it might be. You have to go back several years. I mean, in our state, I would argue that, I think we've been our own worst enemy in so many ways. We have to look at the priorities that are important to the state. In the last 12 years, what has been our priority? The climate, environment, et cetera. Housing is part of that, but there are other priorities that outweigh even the housing conversation. It was only the last couple of years that housing really rose to the forefront, that we started to have these talks about zoning and the different things. So through the process, through legislation, through the government, a lot of that has attributed to the barriers and the problems. We also have to look back at in the most recent history, the crash, right? So before we had the big housing crash, which encompassed financial, which encompassed lending laws, which encompassed all these different things, we were building at an incredible clip. Builders were doing all sorts of stuff. Now, you look at the way that they were financed, and it was a house of cards in so many ways. And when it crashed hard. We've never picked up that momentum. We have a tendency when those things happen, we regulate. We regulated financing and government and loans and all sorts of stuff. We just kept adding on to that, so it made it even more cumbersome to have to go through that process. So it's slowly coming back, but not at the pace that it was beforehand. But in the same breath, in Washington State, and one of the things we debated yesterday during committee, is still the Growth Management Act. It still has to do with where we build, how we build, the UGA, outside, inside. And I think that it has created so many barriers that it still makes it difficult to develop. Yes, we've done things in zoning, density. We have to do so much more. When you talk to people right now, which I do in the development community, they're here today, we're talking about different things, and you ask them, how long will it take to bring units to market? If I was to, do this, how long? And when you hear 2, 3, 4 years, even in the most perfect scenario within the UGA, all the different things, it's too long. Right. So, it's not going to be through the Housing Trust Fund, although that is a tool. It is going to be through incentivizing. It is going to be through reform. It is going to be through a more holistic look at the Growth Management Act. And all these things in concert have to come together to break that down.
Well, and then this gets to another bigger picture question, which is does anybody have a plan to close that 1 million unit gap? And if half of those units do need to be affordable, and if the Housing Trust Fund, even if it wants to be the little engine that could, doesn't have the capacity to do all that, what are some other ways you could get that kind of housing outside of the Housing Trust Fund? So that's sort of it is two questions. Maybe we start with the first. Is there a plan on paper yet to close the 1 million unit gap?
Well, I think there are lots of plans at lots of different levels. In part, GMA requires a comprehensive planning process that builds for local communities to have a plan of how they're going to reach their housing targets. And that was spelled out in House Bill 1220, which really provided direction and clarity on what local communities need to do. Now we need to make sure that they're accountable to doing that. And it is going to take a lot of tools to get us the units we need. The number one thing we need for those affordable homes, though, is resource. And as I mentioned, there is currently no dedicated fund source. There is a bill this session which would create a surcharge on the sale of high-cost properties above $3 million. That would be a dedicated fund source specifically for the Housing Trust Fund. But for the other homes that we need in our community, we really have to empower the market to be able to do that. And we need to take steps to empower the market to do that through many things that I believe we agree on. One, we need to unleash zoning. We have to get rid of restrictive zoning and allow, in particular, for more dense housing that's located near transit. There's a bill this session to help increase density by transit while ensuring that some of those homes are affordable for low-income people. We have to address permitting barriers and cost drivers that are driving up the cost of housing, including in the private market, and take those on as well.
So
and we need to partner between the state and local communities to work together on it. It is a partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector to solve for this problem.
And housing is a very local issue as well. So the state has a role, but it's also the domain of the cities and the counties. So there's three kind of examples of legislation that's moving possible solutions. Where is their alignment, and where if you were the chair and had the votes, where would you go in a different direction?
It sounds great. I mean, it sounds like we are, but it's so incremental, and it's still pick and choose. We're still picking and choosing how much permit reform we're willing to do and how much zoning and where we're going to put it. And, there's still those arguments. There's still those constraints when it comes to GMA. And I would say there's still a lot of resistance to doing these different things.
Would you repeal the GMA if you were a guy?
I don't think we'll ever repeal the GMA. Right. I think it's a question that comes up all the time, and but I think we need to reform it, Austin. It was never meant to be static. It has many tenets. We added another one, and a goal of climate to it. So we've added more pieces that now have to be followed when we're looking to plan. I think we're doing too much planning, too many studies. We have a tendency to do that a lot. We did a Ruckelshaus study here not too long ago. Had some good recommendations for GMA, but it wasn't really a clear, we must do this. And even if we get a clear, we must do this, the legislature has a tendency not to do that. I mean, we'll pick and choose. This dedicated source is a tax. I mean, it's a REIT tax. Let's call it what it is. There's a lot of opposition to it.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to tax our way out of this. We've funded through many years the Housing Trust Fund. We've done the doc recording fee. We've done so many different things within the contents of our state taxation system to do this. So,
what is the opposition to taxing homes selling for $3 million and above at a higher rate for this purpose?
Again, we're saying that we're going to solve this by taxing a certain segment of our marketplace. We have the highest REIT in the country. A couple of years ago, we broke that down. We did a graduated REIT so that it would be effective in certain things. And now we want to hit it again. We're gonna do another taxation. You look at that and you say, well, $3 million is a lot, but you have to look at other properties that fit within that realm, right? And what it will do and how that affects it. So, do we need another dedicated source? That's up for debate. We can talk about if we think taxation is the way to get us out of this. I believe that we actually need to focus on the regulatory side, not necessarily pouring more money into the Housing Trust Fund. We have done that. We have been doing that. And I don't know if that's the best way to do that. We look at property tax. We might have even a broader conversation on tax reform as a whole. I think we've been trying to do that for a couple of years. But there is a lot of resistance on both sides of it around taxation and what works best. I will talk about, we need to do property taxes and sales tax. We need to do everything we can to do what we can to incentivize the private sector. And Austin, no matter how we look at this, there still is what I would call a war against or a opposition that is against the private sector developer. It seems to be when we're looking at this, we will not do it in this sector, we will do it in this sector. And so we have to somehow find a way that we can do that. It took years to get the multifamily housing tax exemption put forth. We're trying to expand that into other arenas. It is challenging to say the least. And we're trying to do that to get more people to use it so it is more friendly to the private sector to encourage that.
Yeah, so just to jump in, I do think that we need incentives and we need partnerships and we need to find opportunities to remove unnecessary regulations to help support the market in creating more housing. But there is no evidence and there is no analysis that there's an alternative way to create housing that's affordable to the lowest income households in our community, of which we need 50% of the million homes need to be affordable to folks at 50% AMI and below. We can't use incentives and the market alone to achieve that. It will take subsidy, it will take investment, and we're going to need to raise revenue to do that.
And how much?
I would just say, Austin, subsidy, I agree. Incentives, yes, all those different things. We're not going to tax our way in by pouring money in one thing. I get it. It feeds this one other side. But again, if you look at a pro forma, if you look at, we've talked about this, then Congressman Heck, now our Lieutenant Governor, we talked about this. It's called a pro forma. We looked at what it takes to build something. And in our state, we have to lower those costs 20 to 25% to get at that.
Well, and so do we know
If you ask
what
somebody say, can you build me a $250,000 home? They're going to laugh in your face. No, we can't. There's no way to do that. And within the last couple of years, data will show you, as we've looked at, we keep adding different things that are adding to the cost of building housing. It's going the opposite way to make affordability.
Well, what is your thought, Representative Alvarado, on just the cost per unit piece? Like, shouldn't we be able to say that if half of those units need to be affordable to the lowest income, that we should be able to say how much it would cost to build, or at least within a range per unit, and then how long it would take, and how long then it takes to get what we need in terms of the housing stock? Like, it seems like it should be pretty simple, but has anybody figured out that math and said, here's a reasonable price, here's how many units we need, and here's how fast we can get it done?
Yeah, well, we know how much it costs to build housing, and we know what the cost drivers of that housing are. And I think where Representative Barkis and I agree is trying to reduce some of those cost drivers. As I said earlier, permitting is costly. It's unnecessary. Things like parking requirements and other unnecessary requirements drive the cost, and we have to do everything possible to tackle that. And in some cases, even when you do that, the math still doesn't work to create an affordable home, and it'll take an additional partnership and investment from the public to make those happen.
And I don't disagree, but also time is a factor, Austin.
Yeah.
Time is money. So when you look at the costs, and the reason why it takes so long at the local government level or at any level is, again, let's go back to the planning. Let's talk about the comprehensive plans. Let's talk about GMA. Let's talk about critical areas. Let's talk about environmental regulations, you name it. You add all these things on, and I go in to get a permit to build something, and I have to secure my financing, which is a challenging, to say the least, in this market, as always. And then I have to take that risk to know how long is it going to take. There's no certainty in that. So yes, those reforms that come into place, if you knew what you needed to do and could bank on that, that helps immediately remove some of those burdens.
Is there
that are
a
in there, so.
specific environmental regulation that you think goes too far, that you could give an example of, that you would say, roll that back, we don't need it?
Critical areas, in some aspects. Critical areas are so important to protecting our environment, and we have to have those, right? But and we've seen this just recently too, when you'll start to go beyond, we'll say we'll put the protections in to make sure they're there, and then it's not enough. It's about trees, it's about this, it's about buffer zones, about all these different things. Here in Thurston County, we've dealt with how many years now? 13 years, 12 years of pocket gopher, as part of the critical area, the endangered, the spotted butterfly, monarch, all the different things that have prevented development, prevented growth within the urban growth area, within these plans, right? And so I think that you have to start finding that balance. We're not going to say, pave it over, sprawl it out, we don't care about the environment. We're Washingtonians. We care about the environment. We want to protect the beautiful state we live in, but there has to be reason within that. And when you have groups that are so entrenched that it's just, they will not move off of any of that, it gets into these different things. And no matter what we do legislatively, unless we change that, we're not gonna move beyond that, and we're still gonna have these problems moving forward. And if you asked earlier, how do we do this?
Yeah.
It's taken us 10, 15, 20 years to get into this problem statement. It's going to take a while to get out of it, but it's going to have to take some radical changes, of what we've done.
So I want to touch on that a little bit, which is the time and how long it's going to take us to get out of the problem that we're in. And that's exactly why I proposed House Bill 2114, which looks at stabilizing renters who are experiencing excessive rent increases now.
And this is the 3% per year cap?
It's a 5% cap in the bill. And again, Representative Barkis and I agree that long-term, we must have supply to address our housing shortage. But we also know that it does take time, and that we have constituents across the state who are really struggling with the impacts of excessive rent increases and what that means on their daily lives. There are older adults who are making really tough choices about whether to pay rent or other life necessities. We see working families who are fighting for wage increases, and then rent is outpacing that. So a key part of our housing strategy has to also be steps to stabilize renters so that they can live with stability in our community.
And this is obviously a major priority of majority Democrats this year, to do some sort of rent stabilization bill. And, well, we made the pivot, so we'll stick with it.
I guess we are.
Yes, we'll stick with it. Why not? It's the 5% is more than, well, it may not be more than inflation. Yeah, let's hope it's more than inflation this year, maybe next year. But why not try to at least benchmark rental increases to some predictable year-over-year increase?
It's not the solution. I mean, I appreciate Representative Alvarado's passion in this space, and I would say that I have equal passion in it. Because I know it, I see it firsthand. I'm doing it as she is. I'm working to house people and dealing with all the things that come into play. I'm sure we will unpack this more, but we can talk about what we've been through the last several years. We've had that conversation on the show, the eviction moratorium, the rent control that was in place at that point in time. And I would say there are other solutions that we can get at, because what you just indicated was we are in a phase in the market where this is a problem. we're hoping to get, we're working to get the supply. We're working to address this. But this is a big policy. This is something that has not been done in other states. Where it has, it's had critical impacts.
But it's not rent control in the classic sense.
You can call it what you want. Stabilization, rent control. Sure, it's not in the classic sense, and even that's fraught because, of course, the argument will be, well, once somebody moves out, you can raise their rent. So guess what's going to happen in the marketplace? People are going to raise their rent incredibly high. Are we going to stabilize rents when after a year people move out and they come back up? So this percentage. We just don't see this in any other aspect of what we do in our marketplace, where we are capping what's doing. We're affecting the market to do that. There are other ways to do this, and this is where we disagree, right? This is where we are trying to figure out some commonality, and I will get into more about what we should be doing to solve
Well,
this
let's do that. Let's pause there because I want to hear what you would do if you could.
Sure.
Just a response to this idea that this is sort of this government coming in and kind of creating this artificial cap on a private marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it is a reasonable regulation that's intended to ensure that there are not excessive rent increases. It still allows landlords to raise the rent. It still allows them to reset the rent when there's vacancy. But what it does is provide some predictability and stability for tenants. I'm a homeowner. I have a 30-year fixed mortgage, and I benefit from the government having come in and helped to back a 30-year fixed mortgage so that I have some predictability and stability. And there are 1 million renter households across Washington state who have no idea what their rent will be. And this is really about providing some of that stability. And it does not come at the expense of also doing supply. This is both and. We will increase supply so that we can continue to help, hopefully, overall reduce costs in the market. But this is a tool for renters who are hurting right now. What
would you do differently? What would be your
first
proposal?
of all, I wouldn't mess with the market in this manner. I mean, we keep talking about that this is, 1 million. I would say that it does not affect the entirety of the rental spectrum, right? This affects a portion of the rental. Yes, there are people who are rent burdened. There are people who need help, and we should help those. That is a role as a function of government, that we help those most in need. That's where the that's where the voucher programs come in. We should
what are
have.
Those?
Well, there's 2 bills. There's a Democrat bill. There's a Republican bill. These are vouchers. We call it bridging the gap. We're looking at creating something where people have the ability to access a voucher that goes to the tenant that it helps bridge that gap for a period of time up to a certain level. So the rent goes up, they have some certain things that they need, say they're $200 short, $300 short, $400 short, where they can do that. It's an immediate, like we said, immediate fix to that. Funding source, one looks at a sales tax, one looks at appropriation. If we want to make it a priority in the government, that we have a lot of money in our state surplus and our state coffers that we could look at doing this. But we have never focused into helping tenants in that manner by creating these voucher programs. Instead, we want to manipulate the market by doing a cap on rent overall. But there's many other things in this bill, Austin, that are not just about a percentage that we're doing on rent. Okay. A lot of other things.
I got to go to break, but let me just hear, why not go for something like a voucher program?
Well, I should say I absolutely support rental assistance. And I think we do need more rental assistance in our community. We have a lot of people who the math doesn't work for their household budget to be able to afford rent. I think there are 2 challenges with the rental assistance proposals that are on the table. One is that, as we talked about, we need more resources, right? Spending money on rent assistance is a spending of public taxpayer dollars. I'll continue to, absolutely, and I'll continue to advocate to bringing more resources to the table so that we can spend on these important purposes. The second piece is that under these bills, the government can be subsidizing rent for individuals who, after a landlord receives that rent payment, they can turn around immediately after and raise the rent, meaning that we continue to be chasing the market with those rent subsidies. I believe that rental assistance would pair really nicely with a rent stabilization program and policy so that we can have predictability in the housing market and then also help provide some subsidy to households who are in need.
Very briefly, then I need a break.
All sounds great, but you can't do it unless you collaborate, unless you're willing to get together in all parties. And that has never happened in this space when it comes to landlord-tenant laws. It's adversarial. It's not like we did in the supply side. There has been no conversations. Nobody's sitting around talking about merging subsidies with stabilization with everything else. So we'll get to that in the next segment, I'm sure, but there's a lot more that we can go into that could, in fact, help people today.
I really look forward to collaborating on this issue.
Okay, let's take a quick break. When we return, we continue our conversation, at times spicy conversation, about the housing challenges facing the state of Washington and efforts underway in the current legislature to address the gap. Back after this.
It will dwarf Katrina. It'll be absolutely the largest thing that we will have had to have dealt with in our country. We know the clock is ticking.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Our focus this week is on Washington's housing crisis and what the legislature is doing to address it. Joining me once again, our state representatives Emily Alvarado and Andrew Barkis. And let me just, before we move on, because there's a lot more to talk about, just ask this question about sort of a grand bargain around vouchers, rent assistance, and stabilization. Why isn't there sort of a blending of these two ideas in some sort of grand bargain?
Well, I look forward to that conversation. Again, I think both are critical tools, and I'd love to see both of them working together. What part of the conversation needs to be an acknowledgement that we do need some reasonable regulations to make sure that there aren't excessive rent increases in our community.
So you can't do that unless there's willingness and collaboration. I think the reason we were so successful the last couple of years, especially Representative Bateman and I and others, is because we worked in the interim. We worked outside of the legislature, and then when we were there, we worked consistently to everybody had to give. And I always call it 70% policy, right? It's like, it's not 100% policy. Unfortunately, on one side, with the low-income housing folks, it is 100%. And there's very little give in the region. You cannot have, in my experience, over almost nine sessions doing this, right? That doesn't happen, and it's very frustrating, right? When you look at the grand bargain, you look at the votes. We have 40, they have 58 in the House. If they had all the votes, we wouldn't even be talking about this. They just would do it. But there's probably not all the votes there because it is a controversial policy in a lot of ways. But let's go back to last year in middle housing. It was the same way, Austin. They did not have, the majority in both chambers did not have the votes to pass middle housing. It was the Republican caucus, it was myself, it was working collaboratively to bring those votes along to pass that policy. Never would have happened if we wouldn't have all sat together. That's not happening in this space. This space, unfortunately, has been so adversarial for so long, tenant versus landlord. 46 pieces of legislation in the last 5 years, Austin, all targeted at landlords. 46 pieces of legislation, 15 passed and are signed into law. Of those, 2 had bipartisan support, only 2. So it tells you there's a history, and I'm trying to break that. I introduced a bill this year to do a task force. I think we need to look at it holistically.
Do you see an opportunity to get past that?
We didn't even hear that bill this year. So.
I think there's always an opportunity to collaborate, and I think process really does matter. Rent stabilization has been a bill that's been before the legislature for many years now. And I think this bill builds upon things that we've learned throughout the process. Unfortunately, there isn't people who are coming to the table to talk about how we can make a rent stabilization policy that works for other members, for primarily Republican members. And I look forward to hearing feedback on what that policy would look like.
Okay.
But the key thing is that we have an urgent situation right now. 40% of my constituents are renters, and they need some relief. And building on 3 years of introducing this bill, we need to have some action now so that people in our communities feel actual relief from the single greatest cost in a household budget, which is housing.
Agree, but if I may.
Very briefly.
Okay. Almost 40% in the entire state rent in some way. But if we don't start talking about the landlords that are providing the housing, that are part of the supply issue, we're missing half the equation of this whole thing. Without housing providers, you don't have tenants. You have to have that commonality. Again, 46 pieces of legislation. Again, this year, another 8 pieces focused at tenant protections not landlords, not in the sense of that. And people are shedding, they're getting out of the business. It has become burdensome, and we're not looking at both sides of this equation when it comes to that.
Well, let me
it's problematic in that aspect.
let me pivot back to supply,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I can connect a thread here. That there is a way we have been doing business for a long time when it comes to housing, and there's these sort of built-in relationships, landlord-tenant that you talked about, and then there's the kinds of housing we build. And I know that you are trying to incentivize some new, accessory dwelling units and lot splitting
Mm-hmm.
and building density around transit. But I wonder if the thinking is out of the box enough. Could you get much more radical? And where my head goes is that if you drive south from Olympia into Lewis County and go south of Centralia and even Chehalis, there's a little development off to the left of what looks like single-wide trailers, except they're actually stick-built homes with a little parking pad. And there's like 15 or 20 of them, and they're very cute. And it's like the only place I've ever seen anything like that. It doesn't look like temporary housing. It doesn't look like a tiny village. It looks like something that might work for a single person, even a couple, maybe a small family. Why don't we have more little postage stamp communities like that, for instance? Why are we still building stick-built and not looking for creative ways to build?
I would love to take this one.
Yeah, no, I think that manufactured and module housing has a real is an opportunity for us. And I think a lot of the technologies continue to change and adapt. They're not as proven at scale, but certainly we need to be looking at more opportunities to supplement and complement stick-built housing with manufactured and modular and factory-built housing. It's an opportunity.
Especially with so many people who are without homes right now, because we're talking about people who can't afford, but we're also talking about a bunch of people on the streets.
Absolutely, but I would argue that those are more strategies that we need. They're additional strategies.
Sure.
They are not a substitute for some of the other things. So this is about taking multiple approaches to have
And what I was
a
asking
robust
is,
market.
are we considering all of the options, the whole?
We are, but we're not doing it, though. I mean, we still have prohibitions where you can cite manufactured housing. We don't have anybody building manufactured housing in Washington State. We used to have 3 factories in Washington State. One was actually located not too far from where those little houses are in Lewis County. I grew up in Chehalis. I actually sold manufactured housing way, way back, and Moduline used to be the builder of that. They're gone. The closest manufacturer is in Oregon. We tried yesterday to talk about, and maybe it'll go through executive today, but where do we site these homes? Most communities don't want them there. And so there's been these different things about, I don't want this in my backyard. We don't, the manufactured housing, stigmatism. It's wrong. I started working with some groups to try to encourage the building of those, whether it's manufactured housing, tiny homes, modular homes, container homes. I mean, there's a company in Tacoma trying to build, they actually build apartment buildings out of modular type of things. Everything has to be looked at, but again, within the state of Washington, you have to ask yourself, why, if there's all these great ideas, why aren't we doing it? And it probably comes down to regulatory environment, cost of doing business, cost of all these other things. I will say, I was just down at Ocean Shores again this weekend, and I tell you, it's one of the most eclectic communities to drive around when you look at it. I mean, talk about diversity in zoning and types of, you'll see single-family, multifamily, little tiny duplexes next to a big house on the beach. I mean, all this stuff. It should be applauded, that community, for what they're doing, and it's a good example. Looks great, but they're meeting that mark. I don't know how they're doing it. I need to talk to them, see how they're building those things down there. But if there was a way, Austin, that we could get past it, even in yesterday's hearing, people from their own associations that talk about these communities are prohibitive of any type of expansion of existing parks outside of the UGA, where people have come in and say, look, we could add another 20 or 30 homes. We need to do more to encourage that. I would love to see that develop up here.
2 things. First of all, absolutely agree that we have to remove barriers to siting housing types in all communities. We see it's extraordinarily difficult to site supportive housing, emergency shelter, and even affordable housing that we know we need in many communities. There is a bill this session to try to push on cities and collaborate with cities to help make sure that siting happens more easily. We also need more housing types, something that we definitely agree on, and there are a lot of bills this session that are looking to be creative about housing types. There's a bill by Representative Gregerson to create more co-housing types that I know is co-sponsored by Representative Barkis. There's a bill by Representative Wallen to help convert unused and vacant commercial spaces into housing. There is a bill to look at new financing opportunities through the State Housing Finance Commission, the Workforce Housing Accelerator. That's a bill funded by, that's a bill sponsored by Representative Levitt. So we are pushing on types of housing, ways to finance housing, and making sure that local communities let us put the housing in place that we so desperately need.
One of the other criticisms that you often hear from Republicans is that Democrats on the sort of environmental side of the ledger are driving up costs by doing things like wanting to not connect to natural gas anymore, requiring building codes that are more efficient. Over the long run, things that perhaps pencil out over 20, 30 years, 50 years of the life cycle of the home, but do add costs in the short term.
Absolutely.
How do you, as a majority Democrat, address that piece? As you're working on this housing crisis, and then you've got colleagues over here who are saying, no more natural gas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, this is the kind of issue where we can find a both and. I believe we can both provide and support environmental sustainability and also solve our housing crisis. And there are some regulations that are cost drivers in housing, but there's a number of untapped opportunities that really could help solve both our environmental and climate challenges and our housing challenges, namely adding more density in urban areas, density by transit. There's a bill this session by Rep. Reed to create more dense housing by transit. That's something that's both good for the environment and good for housing. And on the cost drivers, there are things that long-term will save us costs and are worth it for our environment.
But is there anything you can do in the short term to offset that?
Yeah, in the short term, there are a lot of things that we could do to offset costs. That's why I'm particularly passionate about permitting, because as Representative Barkis said, permitting is not only a cost, but it's a time, and time is money in development. There are things like parking requirements. That's something that if we eliminate required parking minimums, that's good for the environment and good for housing costs.
What about subsidizing the cost of these heat pumps or the higher cost insulation or whatever it is?
May I?
Yeah.
What's a subsidy? A subsidy is a tax. It's a shift. You have to take the money from somewhere, Austin. So, I mean, we're seeing that all around. So my other role is ranking on transportation. So we're trying to balance this out. We've talked about the Climate Commitment Act. We talked about the money coming in. And where's that going to go? So we can say, well, look, we're going to help you out by helping you with a heat pump, but that money comes. I mean, if we're talking about where the priority of where we put in this money, we put it in rental subsidies, we put it in subsidies so that I can put solar on my roof. Natural gas, if we don't have natural gas, we have no dry kiln wood, we have no concrete building materials. Everything that it takes to actually build the homes and products, we need gas to do that. And right now, I don't think there's a substitute for that within the context. So I think this is a great example of where, we have one side that is really wanting to ramp us into a climate goals that are set by our governor. It's been no secret that's his priority. And as a consequence, they do have consequence on the other side and the cost drivers that are part of that. So, whether it's taking natural gas out of building, whether it's building codes that require different environmental, whether it's WUI codes, which are about the wildlife-urban interface codes of what type of windows we have to use, or architecture, all those are cost drivers. All those are going to increase the cost of building homes in Washington State. So you have to temper that out. I think you can find balance. I think we have found balance within the climate and some of these different things, but it does not detract from the point that we continue in the legislature to add on more things, whether it's for climate or something else. We're doing that.
I would also say that we do have a number of incentives that we've supported over the years and have looked at several bills this session to expand tax exemptions to help cover the cost of development, in part to offset costs that exist, but also to provide more affordable housing.
And one last thing, though, I would also say, too, is because I just popped in, you know, when we talk about density and we talk about all these things, these are very Puget Sound-centric words, right? These are things that we have really focused. Transit-oriented development, you're not going to see in Elby or Eatonville, right? You're going to see this in Tacoma or whatever. And that's all good. It's one of the things. But when we look at the housing crisis, it is not just exclusive to the Puget Sound region. It is the entirety of the state. So policy must reflect that.
Well, let's stick with density, though, for a moment, because I do want to, I mean, probably the most closely watched bill, because it's a carryover from last year, is the density around transit. There are issues, obviously, local government has its concerns, and there's also the, what's the right mix? The 10% of units need to be affordable piece. Housing advocates say that's not enough. The developers say it might be too much to incentivize them to build. You've got the concern about gentrifying neighborhoods and pushing existing residents out. Where do you see that particular proposal ending up in this short session? What's your
I'm
prediction?
not going to speculate where
You're
it
not gonna
ends up.
speculate.
It did make it out of the Housing Committee and supported that. Obviously, there are a lot of dials in that bill and conversations that can continue to be had, but I think the fundamentals are this. We need more density by transit. That's an imperative. Two, we need to make sure that as we build more housing, a portion of that housing is affordable to not only the most transit-dependent people who are low-income folks, but also essential working people who we need as part of all communities. And three, that we're engaging with the cities to help support necessary infrastructure investments as we continue to grow. That's the thrust of the bill, it's the spirit of the bill, and I hope that we can move it forward.
And is there bipartisan support for, where
There
are the
was,
fault lines?
and we're trying. It was interesting, the product, I started working on that years ago in the transportation arena, both Chair Fly and I did. And we had a product last year that was more incentive-based. It came out of the Senate, came over to the House, and turned into a different product. That product has those affordability indexes in there, and I think that's where it really kind of went sideways within the context of developer versus affordable, low-income, whatever. And where that sits is there are proposals being put forth, but again, it's pretty rigid in what is wanted. So if you're rigid in what you want, and some of these things come in and are added to it, and they're not, it's not going to move. It's not going to get that support that it needs.
Do you have a prediction?
I don't see it moving this year. I think that I think there's too many pieces still, as Representative Alvarado said. I think there's too many pieces left there, but there are so many agreements. We do all those things she said, density, transit, all those things.
You did pass legislation last year,
It did.
correct me if I'm wrong, to expand density or to increase density in urban areas by having to do with lot size, right? Or the use of lots, allowing fourplexes.
Oh, middle housing.
Middle housing.
Yeah,
That was
right.
absolutely.
So that was your.
That was
a big one.
So,
That was
so
one of the
that,
biggest bills.
right. So that got through.
Yep.
Is the transit? Sorry, that term wasn't coming to me. How could I have forgotten? So if housing passed, how does the transit density compare?
It didn't have affordability indexes. It didn't have a 10% that says you
but
have
is
to
the
do this.
in terms of pieces of the puzzle to get us towards a solution, where does transit density fit, like as compared to middle housing, in terms of the importance you would put upon it as a policy?
Well, there were some pieces in there in the middle housing about
About closeness, proximity
and
to, yes, right.
as related
Sixplexes.
to to parking
Yeah.
and as
Yeah.
related to
Yeah.
these different things. But and there was some affordability on how many units depending on where they're built and it would give you extra units. But
Do you see it as?
Again, I would say we need all types of density. We have to have dense housing by transit. And quite frankly, we see some communities, including the city of Seattle, where I represent part of the city, that is taking advantage and looking forward to building more dense communities by transit. We also need fourplexes and sixplexes in neighborhoods so that people have an opportunity to buy their first starter home and live near the schools where they want to send their kids to schools. And we need accessory dwelling units, and we were able to pass legislation last last session to help provide for 2 ADUs
4
on a
years,
lot.
50, yeah.
And also this session, there are some bills moving forward to look at how we empower more ADUs in more communities.
Okay.
So it's going to take all of these strategies.
Where are we with lot splitting, which is your passion?
There's a good possibility it's dead.
Dead. It passed again on the
94
first day of
4.
session
It was
in the
It was
House.
a beautiful nod to the work that we had done to run that bill the first day.
So what's
and to
the
pass
problem?
it 94 to 4.
Where is
It's in the Senate right now. It's in the committee. There have been negotiations. We took that bill last year, and I think we ran out of time. Really, is what it was. And there were so many pieces of policy, trying to get them all to align. And I think that one kind of fell out in there. And so we spent the interim working with the stakeholders, the cities, and others. To answer the questions. And when we came back, and the bill that we ran, they pulled right back up, was last year's bill. And when it went to the Senate, the whole intent was to work it over and put the substitute on top of it. That has been worked at a high level, but a meeting that was happened last week with what I thought was going to be presenting these solutions was met with a lot of resistance.
What is the argument against it?
Pick one. I mean, cities will argue against creating, again, too much density, allowing for too much stuff. The chair of the committee will argue that it impacts her community in a certain way, and we're going to impact trees and critical spaces, and you know, you just keep piling on. If the longer these bills sit and do this, you'll find a reason to vote against it, right? And so at the end of that meeting, even though we had what was thought to be an agreed upon thing between the stakeholders, what was really told was that they felt from the majority that there was just a lot of resistance to it, didn't know if it would be moving. We'll see. I have not heard if it's moving out of that committee.
I don't want to lose, we just
So-
have a few minutes left. I don't want to lose sight of the unhoused population in this state. Thousands and thousands of people without a home. They've been pushed out as the prices have gone up. They've been pushed down and out. And it goes back again to this thinking creatively. And I've asked the governor this over the years, like, where is the Marshall Plan for homelessness in the
Yeah,
state of
still
Washington? The
waiting
way
for
that
it.
people are living exposed to the elements in dangerous locations, are we not capable of building a lot of emergency housing very quickly and saying, we're capable and we're going to get this done?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I'll start by saying we know that homelessness is a housing problem, and we need housing that's affordable, especially to people with the lowest income and people who might need additional supports.
A lot of complex issues.
A lot of
Yeah.
complex issues. But
Yeah.
we need housing that's affordable to folks. And there are a couple of challenges that are bottlenecking our ability to create housing that's affordable to the lowest income people in our community. One, I mentioned that the Housing Trust Fund has projects that have applied to it to build permanent supportive housing in Olympia and Aberdeen that are sitting unfunded because we don't have enough resource. Two, we know that local communities are putting up obstacles to the siting of permanent supportive housing and emergency housing in their communities. There's a bill, as I mentioned, to help push cities to really help cite the solution to homelessness, which is housing. And then three, I'd say that we know that the more people we help to move off of the streets, there are more and more people who are moving into homelessness. And part of the reason they're moving into homelessness is because they have out of control rents that continue to go up. And we have to address the facts that people are being priced out into homelessness by implementing policies like rent stabilization now.
Good segue. You know, the problem is that we have to also look at the drug addiction mental health crisis that we see, Austin. You know, for far too long, we keep saying that, you know, landlords' evictions cause homelessness. This causes homelessness. This causes we see that, and we do have this tremendous problem, and I agree. We've had this conversation. I've had the conversation with the governor. Why don't we have a Marshall Plan? You know, I met with him and I said, why don't we treat this in the same way that we treated COVID, as a crisis? Why aren't we implementing, you know, immediate shelter setups? Why aren't we doing, you know, bringing people off the street? So, you know, he has his right-of-way initiative, but to the point that Representative Alvarado on these other types of housing, you can't just take people out of a tent city on Slater County, replace it with a bunch of rocks, and stick them in a hotel in Lacey, because it's problematic. And what we're finding is the people I'm talking to, from the mayor to other people, there is more drug activity going on and crime and everything else within that. We're not solving the problem. Literally, 100 units. I mean, they have so much meth use going on. I talked to one council member that toured it, and the city manager's coming to talk to me about it. We have to have more robust services. We have to look at this where everybody stands and treat all aspects of homelessness in some form of plan like that. So, you know, we can build all these, we can buy hotels, we can put people in there, but unless we're helping solve the problems,
Well, and so we
We're not
have
gonna
a
get
minute left, and I'll just mention that we didn't get to workforce, but
another whole
but
issue,
that is
yeah.
a whole other issue. It's an issue and a holdup for building. It's an issue in terms of staffing, the kinds of supports that you're talking about that these individuals would need. It's just a ripple effect. It's affecting the healthcare, the mental health industry, so many elements and parts of the economy right now. A final thought, 20 seconds each, sort of where you want to leave us, especially considering it's a short session, but that this is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Some partisan agreement and some bipartisanship and some disagreement. But Representative Alvarado.
Well, I'll just close by saying that I think our housing crisis is totally solvable. And I look forward to us continuing to take steps to do the three key things that we need to do. One, build more housing in the market and reduce barriers to building housing in the market. Two, getting more resources so that we can invest in affordable housing that's not provided by the market. And three, stabilizing renters and homeowners now so that they can have safe lives in our community.
Okay. Can you do it in 5 seconds?
thanks.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Collaboration. I just hope that we can build on the collaboration we have because we're not doing it in multiple areas. And so we'll see where it goes.
Okay. Representatives Barkis and Alvarado, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching
Thanks.
Inside Olympia, and we'll see you again next week.